Japan decides to deport Chinese activists who landed themselves in the middle of a territorial dispute. How will this affect relations between Asia's two biggest economies? Will the increase in nationalist sentiment make the dispute even more complicated? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. Japan said it will deport Chinese activists arrested on Wednesday for landing on a disputed island. As the activists were being questioned, some media reports suggested their deportation might diffuse the tension between Asia's biggest economies. At the heart of the territorial dispute between China and Japan, an island chain under Japanese control that's also claimed by Taiwan. The islands are known as Senkaku in Japan, Diaoyu in China, and Diaoyutai in Taiwan. They're close to strategic shipping lanes and are thought to have oil deposits. Japan is also locked in another territorial dispute with its former colony, South Korea. Both claim sovereignty over another island chain known as Takeshima by the Japanese and Dokdo by the Koreans. Now, all these disagreements are linked to Japan's 20th century military expansion across Asia. Also adding to the anger of Japan's neighbors was the way two Japanese cabinet ministers decided to mark the anniversary of the end of World War II in the Pacific. Harry Fawcett explains.
On a day commemorating a surrender came a gesture of defiance. Jin Matsubara was one of two cabinet ministers to ignore their prime minister's call and visit Tokyo's controversial Yasukuni shrine. Such gestures always anger China and South Korea, which see them as official veneration of the 14 convicted war criminals enshrined here, along with the 2 million war dead. Matsubara had insisted his was a private visit, but still used it to criticize South Korea's president.
The South Korean president's visit to Takeshima Island, I don't believe it was the appropriate action to take.
Last Friday, Lee Myung-bak became the first South Korean president to land on the twin outcrops South Korea calls Dokdo, Japan calls Takeshima, and acclaimed by both sides. Deep into his last months in office, his decision came weeks after his government's last-minute scrapping of a military deal with Japan in the face of political and popular opposition. He used Wednesday's Liberation Day speech to call for compensation for the surviving few dozen of the thousands of so-called comfort women used as sex slaves by Japanese troops during World War II.
It was a breach of women's rights committed during wartime, as well as a violation of universal human rights and historic justice. We urge the Japanese government to take responsible measures in this regard.
In his commemorative speech, Japan's Prime Minister spoke of the need to maintain Japan's pledge not to wage war again. But he's under pressure to stand up to Japan's neighbors, and so chided his South Korean counterpart for his demand this week for a sincere apology from the Japanese emperor. August the 15th, 1945 was the day that ended years of war and decades of Japanese colonial control in Northeast Asia. 67 years later, that history still has the power to fracture relationships anew. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera.
So could these territorial disputes in Asia lead to armed conflict? To look into this, we're joined by our three guests in Hong Kong. Andrew Leung, he's an economist and political commentator. In Washington, D.C., Bruce Klingner, a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, a conservative American think tank. And via broadband from Tokyo, Brett Bull, a freelance reporter who's worked in Japan for 10 years. Let's go straight to Tokyo. Brett Bull, this isn't all about Japan and China. There are obviously many other countries in the region that are either directly or indirectly involved in these territorial disputes. But why are we seeing these escalating tensions now? Is China provoking Japan when these Chinese dissidents and activists landed on this long disputed island chain? Or was Japan actually provoking its neighbors with the visit of these two politicians to that World War II shrine in Tokyo?
Well, I think you have to go back to April when Governor Ishihara of Tokyo first made the statement that he wished to purchase the Senkaku Islands. And then it became an issue again. And it became an issue after there was the two boats collided in 2010. And this brought it back to the surface again. And since then, it's been a case of, it's been escalating.
Andrew Leung, in Hong Kong, there's no doubt there has been lingering anti-Japan sentiment in the region for quite some time. But is this also an issue of the reemergence of nationalism in the area and politicians, both in Seoul and in Beijing, trying to tap into this reemergence of nationalism, trying to further their own political gains, certainly with elections looming in these two countries?
Well, this is certainly the case in Japan. For example, the Japanese Prime Minister did say that he's not going to visit the shrine and also asked his cabinet not to do so. But then there were two cabinet members pretending that it was their private visits, suggesting that they want to capitalize on this and to build up their own electoral capital. Don't forget the Japanese Prime Minister's political clout is beginning to decline, and there are various members of his group seeming to split away. So that's one side of the picture. The other side of the picture, of course, this suggests that there is also rising nationalism, both in Japan and in China. And don't forget, a lot of the people in Japan were born after the Second World War, and they have very little memory of what Japan did during the war. And so they see that why Japan is the third largest economy in the world and is still a very, very powerful country, can't stand up on its own.
But the practice of visiting the shrine, though, the practice of visiting that shrine, though, isn't new. In fact, politicians have done that ever since 2006 under the Prime Minister then, Koizumi. So it isn't new. And many would argue that, in fact, South Korea's President Lee Myung-bak visited the disputed island as well, as a way to boost his own flagging popularity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, as you said, there was nothing new in this. I mean, the visit of the shrine and the occasional, sort of confrontation over these islands. But what is now new now is changing geopolitics in the region, particularly in the wake of the Americans' new strategy, the so-called pivot to Asia, and forming military ties and also various other alliances with China's neighbors, and a number of whom have territorial disputes with China. Now, don't forget, all these Chinese neighbors rely on China's market. China is the biggest economy for most of them, or for virtually all of them, including Japan. But on the other hand, they do feel that the rising China somehow would diminish their negotiating power and also their national kind of dignity, as it were. So they rely on they're riding on the American military umbrella to boost up their own national strength, as it were.
Let's get the view then.
China.
Let's get the view then from Washington. And forgive me for interrupting you, but Bruce Klingner, how much of a difficult position then does all of this put President Obama in? He signaled that he wants a bigger role for the United States in Asia through that shift in policy, what's known as a pivot to Asia. How much of a difficult time will he have in trying to decide on which side to weigh? Will he support his Japanese or his South Korean ally, and how does he deal with China?
Right. There are a number of territorial disputes in Asia right now, the two you've pointed out, and actually even more importantly, the disputes between China and 7 other Asian countries in the South China Sea, which is the area where it's more likely to lead to an armed clash. The Japanese-South Korean dispute is cyclical. We've seen this come up in 2005, for example. There was very strong nationalism in Japan, and they sort of initiated a strong response from South Korea. It's not likely to lead to an armed clash. It does, unfortunately, raise tensions between 2 U.S. allies in the region. And the U.S. is very neutral, has a very strict neutral position on the sovereignty issue of Tokto Takeshima. But it is unfortunate in that it complicates U.S. efforts to have allied congruence on issues in light of the growing North Korean and Chinese security threat to the region. The Senkakus and the South China Sea, those are linked because they're due to increasing Chinese assertiveness and even belligerence in the region as it seeks a larger role in the region. Right now, a dispute between the Philippines and China over sovereignty in the South China Sea. We've had sort of minor tactical level naval clashes between the Philippines and China. And that's the area where I think the U.S. is most concerned about some kind of clash between an ally and China.
Brett Bull, is the perceived threat from China what is driving some of these countries in the Asia-Pacific region to turn to the United States? The U.S. clearly is sending all sorts of signals, including all sorts of emissaries and top officials to that region, to Vietnam, to Thailand in recent weeks, in order to negotiate these bilateral agreements that would enable the U.S. to expand its presence. Is that what is the driving force, the U.S.'s desire to undercut China's growing influence, and will it serve to improve the situation there, perhaps even to make things worse than they already are?
From a political standpoint, I don't know, but I do think that a lot of this is due to the fact that Japan was made to look very bad in 2010 when it had to hand over the Chinese ship captain, who was in the boat collision in the dispute over the Senkaku Islands. I think that Japan was made to look somewhat cowardly, and I think they want to be strong, and they need to project themselves in the region. The Senkakus represent natural resources. Japan is an island nation. It needs to protect what it's got. I think that's huge. I think both those two issues are huge.
If I can turn to Andrew Leung again in Hong Kong, we're hearing a lot of obviously scaled up rhetoric. Is this just saber rattling, or are we likely to see this turn into something more, into some kind of an armed conflict between any of these different players?
Well, I don't think that any major military confrontation is likely because both China and Japan, and indeed all of China's neighbors, do not want a war and indeed cannot afford a war in this region. But on the other hand, nationalism is rising, and of course for China, territorial integrity sits at the very heart of China's national psyche. So, and for China particularly, the South China Sea is not just about territorial disputes. It's also a very essential conduit of China's the import of energy resources from around the world. So for China, it is really a channel of her lifeblood. And that's why China is very, very sensitive.
We'll look at that issue in just a moment.
Region, about her influence in the region.
But what do you make, though, of the words of the governor of Tokyo, who has recently said that Japan is heading for an inevitable confrontation with China? Is he simply playing up to the nationalists?
Well, I think that he's mainly saying this for political reasons. I don't think that the Japanese people actually want a war, and that means the politicians cannot afford to provoke a war. But I think that the politicians need to appear to be very, very strong to defend their perceived national sovereignty. But I think that this is not just a question about Japan and China. You've got to look at it in a much broader context. And we just talk about the role of the United States and the interests of the United States in the region, and all this confluence of national interests, come to a head in the South China Sea. So that needs to be handled very, very carefully.
How carefully will it be handled by Washington, Bruce Klingner? A lot at stake, obviously, for the United States, but it has to tread very carefully, doesn't it?
Exactly, and the U.S. is concerned about the various territorial disputes. Washington tries to be strictly neutral on the sovereignty issue, but the United States government affirms, though, that we do not see the need or the advantage of using military force or even intimidation by a large nation against smaller nations to influence these sovereignty issues. So although the U.S. does not take a position on Tokto Takeshima or the South China Sea, we certainly see the need to defend our allies against intimidation by China. During the 2010 Senkakus incident, the U.S. really for the first time made very clear that the U.S.-Japan bilateral defense treaty did apply to the Senkakus. That statement by Secretaries of State, Defense, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was meant to allay concerns of our Japanese ally that we would stand by them in case China did try to assert its sovereignty over the Senkakus.
Can the U.S. really be neutral, though, in the region? And with China bankrolling so much of the U.S.'s mounting debt, can Washington afford to alienate Beijing?
Well, it's a question of, certainly on the one hand, not wanting to alienate China or undermine the very important bilateral Washington-Beijing relationship. On the other hand, that does not mean Washington needs to acquiesce to any Chinese demands. So right now, if it's trying to intimidate the Philippines or Japan using its increasing military presence and assertiveness, Washington also can't back down in defending our allies, which we are bound by treaty to defend.
Brett Bull, when we look at these islands and island chains, and you look at them, a lot of them are not very impressive for outsiders who look into them, many of them uninhabited, rocky structures. But how much does the issue of energy that could surround them, the potential for hydrocarbons, for oil and gas, how much of that is a driving factor in what any of these countries are after when they claim sovereignty at any price over these territories?
I would have to say it's the number one driving factor. As I said before, and as your reporter was saying, there are natural resources at stake. And Japan is an island country. It has to import most of its energy resources, and it cannot show weakness in this regard, I feel. And I think this is the number one issue in all of this.
But there's also an issue of prestige, obviously, and not losing face and losing ground against any of your enemies.
Well, that goes back to what I said as far as the 2010 incident with the ship captain. I think Japan lost a lot of face in that, and it needs to assert itself.
And what about the perceived threat from China, at least when some of these other countries are concerned, Andrew Leung? How much of that is what drives many of these Southeast Asian countries to look toward the United States, to look for some kind of a safety net, a guarantor of safety for them in the region?
Well, you've got to look at the situation from a historical perspective. Now, all these territorial disputes have been with us for a long, long time. But why all of a sudden all these are coming to a head? And as I was saying that all these China's neighbors, they're aware of all these disputes, and they're not giving up on the territorial claims all along. But all along they have been keeping quite quiet until recently as a result of the American new pivot to Asia. And so all these countries have been emboldened to exert their territorial claims. And of course, China, as I was saying, territorial integrity sits at the heart of the national psyche. So that brings the two sides to a head. And I think for China, the most important thing is territorial integrity. And the second one, of course, is the safety of the transportation of China's essential energy and resources from all around the world. So I think that these are very, very important issues for China.
And China says Japan is pushing these tensions to a new high, but what does Japan really gain from doing that? Andrew Leung.
Well, I think that Japan, I think recently, for example, the visits to the shrine, and of course the suggestion of buying these islands from the alleged private owners, is also a kind of political posturing for the politicians. And I don't think that the Japanese people is really the driving force behind it. But of course, the Japanese people do regard the national sovereignty is important. But I think that what has provoked this, in a way, is the kind of political posturing. And I think for China, the most important thing is that most of the Chinese people feel that Japan as a nation has not really really admitted its guilt during the Second World War, the aggression, compared to, for example, Germany. Now think if Germany should pay a visit to a shrine, of Hitler's grave, as it were, and you can think that what kind of impact it would have to the former victims of the Second World War. So I think that you've got to look at this from that point of view as well.
Just on Wednesday, though, the Prime Minister of Japan, Yoshihiko Noda, acknowledged the, quote, enormous damage and suffering caused by Japan to other countries during World War II. Brett Bull, has Japan lacked sincerity in its expressions of public remorse, its acknowledgement of the role it played during World War II, that it caused so much suffering, as South Korea claims?
Certainly. I think that if you look at what the perceptions in South Korea, the perceptions in China, they certainly demand more of more deeper apologies, more consistency from what comes out of the government of Japan. And I think that one interesting thing yesterday was that the two cabinet ministers that went to Yasukuni Shrine, they represented the first time that the new government, the new Democratic Party of Japan, made a visit to Yasukuni Shrine. The last time the cabinet minister went was when the LDP was in power. So you could be seeing some sort of a shift here. It could be them trying to ratchet themselves up in that regard.
Bruce Klingner, looking at it from Washington's perspective, we've talked obviously about this new priority the United States administration has outlined for itself in the region. But what will look, from the U.S. perspective, more concerning? Will it be the territories, the disputes that involve China or Japan? And how does the U.S. differentiate between these two different players in that region?
Right. The United States is far more concerned about the disputes involving China and Japan on the Senkakus and the Southeast Asian countries in the South China Sea. The Asia pivot is driven primarily by concerns in the region about Chinese expansionism, assertiveness, whatever you want to call it. Southeast Asian nations, including Australia, have contacted Washington. They're increasingly concerned about Chinese behavior, increased Chinese military assets, and increased Chinese military capabilities, and the willingness to use it, particularly in the last several years. So in response to these concerns, particularly from Southeast Asia, the Obama administration emphasized a reprioritization of a U.S. focus on the Pacific. The Asia pivot, really nothing's pivoting from the drawdown in U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan and Europe toward the Pacific. So there are concerns in some circles here in Washington that the Asia pivot is actually very strong on rhetoric, but very short on resources.
What about concerns in the region? What about concerns in the region itself, and the argument made by some that the U.S.'s increased military presence might actually do more harm than good in a region that's already clearly on edge?
Well, the U.S. really hasn't increased its military presence, and that's one of the concerns about the Asia pivot is there are no permanent new force deployments that have been identified by the Obama administration. There will be rotational assignments, Marines down to Darwin, Australia, 4 ships to Singapore, and a few special forces to the Philippines. But that's one of the things is the Obama administration is robbing Peter to not pay Paul. They're drawing down in Europe and Iraq and Afghanistan, but those forces are not going to the Pacific. And that our Asian allies and friends certainly can identify that, and some have expressed concern privately to Washington that the lack of resources at a time when the U.S. is cutting its defense budget by already $500 billion and an additional $500 billion if sequestration occurs, that the U.S. won't be able to deliver on its promises to defend friends and allies in Asia.
Andrew Leung, is it good for the region to see a reemergence of America's presence in the region, whether it be through permanent bases or other forms of arrangements with some of these countries?
Well, even though the American military redeployment to the Asia Pacific is not as strong as it was originally thought, but there is no doubt that the American military presence in the Pacific is predominant. There is no way that any countries could even match a fraction of Americans' military strength. But by reposturing, as it were, to Asia, that there is an inevitability in the various consequences. As I was saying, there was immediately emboldened some of China's neighbors to exert their sovereignty. And also, as a consequence, there is no way that China would not, again, safeguard its own sovereignty. And of course, with the posturing towards Asia, and China would be increasingly concerned about the security of its transportation routes, of the energy supply from the Middle East, from all around the world, which is in fact China's lifeblood.
Sure, a lot of dynamics at play, obviously. We'll have to leave our discussions there for the moment, though. In Hong Kong, Andrew Leung; in Washington, Bruce Klingner; and via broadband from Tokyo, Brett Bull. Thank you very much indeed for joining us as well for this edition of Inside Story. You can, of course, send us your feedback, as always, by emailing us your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Reemergence, and the team, thank you for watching.